Hello, my name is Eric Schmidt and I'm the owner of Untitled Crafts LLC. This video is intended to give my customers an overview of what goes into making a piece of WTC armor. For this video I've elected to make a pair of poleyns, also more commonly referred to as soup can knees. This is a fairly large set of soup can knees made to fit a knee over 5.5 inches wide. And while not as exciting or flashy as a piece of fully articulated armor leg harness, for example, the techniques that go into making this piece are pretty representative of the techniques and processes that will be used in any piece of armor coming out of this shop. So we hope you find this educational and interesting, and thank you very much for watching.
To begin, the pattern is marked out onto a steel sheet and cut out with a throatless shear. Designing patterns is well beyond the scope of this video, so I'll be using one of my stock patterns. Freshly cut steel can often have sharp edges and what I like to call spikes of death, so the edges are smoothed and beveled on a belt sander so I don't cut myself while working the piece. I like to start my pieces off with a shallow dishing pass to give them a bit of a shape before moving on to raising. Dishing is one of the easiest forming techniques, but it's not particularly suited to very deep shapes. The reason for this is that dishing thins the metal, and on very deep shapes this can actually pose a problem. It's often why very inexpensive armor that is also very deep is often welded into components. It avoids this issue. The other downside of dishing is that you don't get the fine control and detail that you can get via raising. Once the dishing pass is done, the piece is annealed in a forge to soften the metal to prepare it for raising. Annealing is done by heating the piece to its critical temperature and then allowing it to cool slowly. Now the upside to dishing will be made very obvious by this video. A piece made using only dishing will take a fraction of the time as a piece made with raising. So this begs the question, what makes raising worth the extra labor, skill, and thus cost? And the answer to that is detail. To truly capture the aesthetic and function of medieval armor, the authentic and subtle lines and curvature, the closely tailored fit, and the articulations, the armorer really needs to utilize raising. Now this is not to say that every piece of armor that is dished is crap. There are many components of a harness, such as spalders and pauldrons for example, which can be made to a very, very high standard using only dishing because they're fairly shallow. But in my opinion, very deep pieces such as elbows and knees, the difference between dishing and raising is often the difference between a medieval-esque imitation and a piece of armor that could really be considered a reproduction. So turning back to the video, the first pass of raising was completed and the pieces were put back into the forge to be annealed. Raising very quickly work hardens the steel, and so generally after each pass of raising it needs to be re-annealed to ensure that it stays cooperative. Now as you're watching this video, the reason that this technique is referred to as raising should be pretty obvious. So you can see that the shape of the poleyn is raising up out of the plane of steel. After the second pass is complete on both pieces, we go back into the forge to re-anneal them, and the third pass begins again. The entire process is repeated. Each consecutive pass slowly deepens the shape. Now as for the raising itself, a special raising hammer is used to strike just off center of the point of contact on the ball stake. If you look carefully, you can see this creates a wave that moves down the metal as we form the piece. Now by varying the size and the shape of the hammer, the spacing of the hammer strikes, and most importantly the angle of the piece in relation to the ball stake, you have very fine control over the curvature of the piece. Most importantly, it allows you to make asymmetrical shapes, which is something that's very difficult to do with just dishing. And back into the forge. The first poleyn is finished cooling, so we're putting the second poleyn into the forge to do another anneal before the fourth raising pass. Now the fourth pass is a little different because the poleyn from top to bottom has a more shallow and gradual curve than from side to side. So this pass focuses on giving those sides a really steep curve to really pull those ends in. And lastly, the piece is given a quick bowing pass where a very broad, smooth hammer is used to strike right onto the ball stake to just even out the piece. Flares, in addition to giving these poleyns their aesthetic quality, also serve three practical purposes. First, they massively strengthen and stiffen the piece. Much like angle iron and I-beams are much more difficult to bend than flat stock, the opposing angles of flares, creases, and flutes in armor act almost as braces to mechanically stiffen and strengthen a piece of armor. Additionally, poleyns of this type were often the sole piece of steel armor on the leg. Since the thigh and shin may not be covered by plate, the flares also serve to deflect points away from the rest of the leg. Lastly, the flares point the edge away from the body, and thus they are a bit more comfortable to wear. Domed steel really doesn't like being bent into an opposing curve. Therefore, if I attempted to pound these flares into the piece cold, not only would I have very sore and tired hands, but the rest of the poleyne would actually flatten out. Now obviously that would be a problem, as I would have to duplicate a lot of the work put into the previous raising passes. To avoid those problems, an oxygen propane rosebud torch is used to heat only the specific area of the piece that will be worked. This minimizes deformation to the rest of the piece and requires a lot less force to work. You may have noticed earlier in the video that when I'm done heating the piece with the torch, I place it down on this lever and then it makes a funny sound. That lever is actually a gas saver. The weight of the torch on the lever closes a valve which cuts off the gas, and thus the torch isn't burning fuel while it's not in use. Even with the torch, the piece can still flatten out some during flaring, so one more raising pass is done to the sides of the poleyne just to bring those ends in and make sure it's a nice deep shape. During and after these last few raising passes, the flares are evened out and the transition line sharpened by going over them again with a very slightly rounded hammer and closely spaced blows. This quasi-bowing pass also ensures that the angle of the flare is smooth and consistent. The poleyns then go back into the forge for one more annealing pass. What this does is normalize the piece to relieve any leftover stresses from the previous steps. As you can see, the flares are pretty even, but the rest of the piece is pretty rough and bumpy. So the poleyne is now given a much more thorough bowing, where the entire surface of the piece is sandwiched between a smooth hammer and the ball stake. As you can clearly see, this smooths out the steel and also allows me to fine-tune the shape of the poleyne. The central crease on these poleyns, much like the flares, is both a defining aesthetic feature as well as a way of strengthening the piece. Setting the crease is amusingly low-tech. A modified chisel is used to press the steel into a crack or a channel in a wood stump, or in this case, into a welded creasing tool. Though, as always, it's not quite that simple. This method leaves a very rounded crease with depressions on either side of the line. These need to be cleaned up by back raising against an anvil, where that metal is pressed back into line with the rest of the piece. As you can see here, the metal on the left side has been back raised and the metal on the right still has a depression. Lastly, the crease is still fairly round in front, so a fluting stake is used with a light, flat-faced hammer to sharpen up the line and even out the crease. Planishing is the last stage of forming, and it's also perhaps the one time where I really hate my job. The entire surface area of the piece has gone over again. This time with very closely overlapping blows using a very light, highly polished planishing hammer. The goal is to remove as many previous hammer marks as possible and to create a surface that is smooth to the eye and to the touch. After the first planishing pass, the piece is given a rough sanding. This reveals all of the low spots and hammer marks that haven't yet been taken out. You can see these in the video as dark spots and they all need to be hammered smooth. Then, after a sigh of relief that the planishing is finally done, the holes for the strapping and articulation are punched with a metal punch. Heat-treated carbon steel, also referred to as spring steel, provides tremendous benefits over mild steel and even stainless steel. To demonstrate, these test plates were shot with a black powder musket and dueling pistol. This mild steel plate was dented by the dueling pistol in a fashion very similar to many period proofing marks, but the musket ball goes right through. This next piece was heat-treated with a soft temper, and you can see that the musket ball still penetrates but with far less energy. The steel is still a bit on the soft side and is actually torn under the force of the impact. The third piece was heat treated with a medium temper, and we were pretty surprised to find it actually completely stopped both shots. While the musket ball has made a mess of things, the dueling pistol doesn't even leave a dent. This last piece was given a hard temper, and you can see how the increased brittleness causes the plate to crack, and the musket ball was able to penetrate, though again with much less energy than the mild steel plate. The dueling pistol again doesn't even dent it. For more comparison, this is a piece of 18 gauge mild steel, and you can see when put in a vise it bends very easily and it stays bent. When put on the anvil, the behavior is the same. It dents and deforms very easily with very little force. The first stage of heat treating carbon steel requires heating the piece to red heat and then quenching it into oil. The piece is heated using a large heat treating kiln. This step is usually referred to as hardening or quenching. I prefer using oil to water, as water is much harsher and often risks warping a piece and thus destroying the last few hours of work. Additionally, I use canola oil rather than a petroleum-based oil so that it don't die any younger than necessary. After the piece comes out of the oil, there is a nerve-wracking moment where it's given a once-over to ensure that it has not warped or cracked during heat treatment. After being given the nod of approval, we can move on to the next step. At this stage, the steel is much like glass in that it is very hard but also very brittle. It will destroy most drill bits and files, but any impact or bending will cause it to shatter. Now, this level of hardness might be desirable if we were making a razor blade, but it's completely unacceptable for armor. It would catastrophically shatter whenever it was struck, sending shards of very sharp metal into the wearer. To alleviate this brittleness, a second heating is required. The steel is reheated in a kiln to a much lower temperature referred to as drawing range. Simply put, this allows us to have our cake and eat it too by relaxing the structure of the steel so that it loses most of its brittleness while also retaining much of its hardness. This step is referred to as tempering. This piece of tempered steel was given a soft temper, and as you can see, it's much more difficult to bend the piece, and more importantly, it springs back to its original shape, hence spring steel. When put on the anvil, the piece is much more difficult to deform than mild steel, but more importantly for armor, it does not crack. Now that the poleyns are formed and heat treated, it's time to make them shiny. First, the baked on oil and scale from heat treating is removed to the wire wheel, and the poleyns are given a rough sanding. To prevent rust, the inside of the poleyns are primed and painted. Fine sanding is done on a setup wheel using a series of progressively finer grits from 220 to 600, and then finished with buffing compound. The final and all too often overlooked step in finishing is smoothing out and rounding the edges of the plates. As you can see, several passes at different angles are made all along the edge to round it as much as possible, and I frequently check the edge with my fingers and sand as necessary. In light of the fact that these plates and other components of armor will be driven into the wearer's body essentially with clubs, extra time and attention during this step is very well worth it. Special attention is paid to the corners, which if left alone can often resemble the point of a dull knife, which is obviously dangerous. A nice touch on our custom armor is that the buckles and hinges are all handmade from scratch in-house, usually by an apprentice. To make buckles, steel rod is heated and formed around a mandrel, cut and then welded to produce a very strong buckle. The weld is then ground smooth and rounded out via sanding on the contact wheel and filing. The buckle is then heated to give it a uniform blackened color and flattened out on the anvil. As a little decorative detail, a chisel is used to engrave lines on the buckle. The tongue is then made by bending a smaller steel rod around a mandrel and using heat and pliers wrapped around the buckle. Once attached, the tongue is given some shaping to make it look a little nicer, as well as to make it work a little better. The tip of the tongue is also given a slight angle and is flattened out on the edge of the anvil. We like to make our buckles in batches and also to leave them blackened. Each buckle is finished by being dipped in an old blacksmith's mixture of heated waxes and oils to protect them against rust. Ironically, this clip was filmed while it was drizzling. Winter Tree Crafts used to primarily make leather goods, and so I have some tools left over from those days that are very handy for making strapping for armor. This tool bevels all 4 edges of a strap simultaneously. Please forgive the poor camera angle, the leather bench area is a little cramped. These straps were previously cut from full sides of leather and are simply cut to length and the necessary slots and tips punched into them. This very handy tool makes quick work of punching many evenly spaced holes into strapping. And lastly, the assembled strapping is riveted onto the poleyn. These hammer strikes to peen the rivets are the last of thousands, if not tens of thousands of hammer blows that go into the crafting of a piece of medieval armor.